The night Sylvie Calloway walked into that field, she had no idea she would not walk back out the same way she came in. She had no idea that the darkness already gathering at the edge of the tree line was not just the kind that came with sunset. She had no idea that what she thought would be a quiet 10-minute check on a horse she barely knew would become the night her life, and the life growing inside her, hung on the intelligence of an animal most people would have been afraid to touch. She was 32 weeks pregnant, alone on a property that sat 7 miles from the nearest paved road. And the storm that the Weather Service had downgraded to a watch was already building behind the mountains in a way that none of the forecasts had predicted. The horse saw it first, but she did not know that yet. Nobody knew anything yet. And what happened in the hours that followed would be talked about in that county for years. Not because it was impossible, but because it should have been. Sylvie had arrived at the Harlan property 3 days before she was supposed to. That was the first thing that nobody expected. She was not due until Thursday. The lease on her apartment in Asheville had ended 2 weeks ahead of schedule because her landlord had sold the building without warning, and with only the limited budget of someone who had spent the last year working freelance graphic design contracts and stretching her savings across a pregnancy she had not planned in the way most people plan things. She had called her older brother Theo and asked if she could stay at his place in the western part of North Carolina while she figured out her next step. Theo was not there when she arrived. He had taken a construction job 3 states away that was running longer than expected. And in the strange, compressed way that difficult seasons of life tend to stack themselves one on top of another, he had arranged for his neighbor, a man named Garrett Harlan, to let Sylvie have access to the property. Garrett ran a small working horse operation on about 40 acres that sat adjacent to Theo's 4-acre parcel. He was in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered, quiet in the way that people who work outdoors for decades become quiet. He was not unfriendly. He was simply a man who communicated in the language of practical things, which meant that when he met Sylvie in the gravel driveway that first afternoon, he showed her how the well pump worked, with a spare key to Theo's place hung on a nail inside the barn, in which gate she should never open unless she asked him first. That last instruction, she would remember later, was the one he gave with the most weight. He said it plainly enough, pointing toward the far end of the property where a dark shape moved slowly behind a fence line of split cedar rail. He said that horse is not social the way the others are. He said he is fine, he is healthy, but he has a particular personality, and you are not to try to work with him on your own. He said it the way someone says something they assume will not need to be repeated. Sylvie had nodded and looked toward the fence. The shape she had seen moving resolved itself into something that stopped her breath for a moment, without her fully understanding why. The horse was enormous, not just in the way that all horses carry a certain physical authority, but in a way that seemed to go beyond size. He was black in a way that did not catch the afternoon sun the way most dark horses did, but absorbed it, so that he seemed both to be made of shadow and to generate something like his own low-frequency light. His mane was thick and wild, and fell in long waves along a neck that arched with the particular pride of an animal that has never had that confidence worked out of it. He stood completely still in the way that only very powerful things can stand completely still, as though stillness itself was something he was choosing rather than something that had simply come over him. He was looking at her. She told herself later that horses look at everything, that it was projection, that she was 7 months pregnant and running on inadequate sleep and more fear than she had admitted to anyone, and that she had simply attached significance to an animal making eye contact because her brain was in the kind of emotional state that finds meaning everywhere. She told herself that. She still remembered the way it felt. Garrett had said the horse's name was Onyx. He had come to the property 2 years earlier as part of a disputed estate sale where nobody had wanted to deal with the logistics. of placing a horse of his temperament, and Garrett had taken him mostly out of stubbornness and some feeling he could not articulate clearly. He was not a rescue in the broken sense. He was not damaged. He had been trained and trained well. But he had also, somewhere in his history, learned exactly where his boundaries were, and he enforced them with a calm authority that most people found unsettling in an animal. Garrett had said, "He is not mean. He just sees things clearly." The first 2 days on the property passed quietly. Sylvie set up Theo's small house, which smelled like wood stain and old coffee, and she arranged the single bedroom so that the light from the east window would fall across the bed in the morning. She had a doctor's appointment scheduled for Friday, a phone check-in with her midwife on Wednesday, and a video call with her mother in Vermont that she had been rescheduling for 3 weeks because she did not yet know how to explain everything that had happened without it turning into a conversation she did not have the energy to have. The pregnancy had not been part of a plan that involved anyone else. That was not how she phrased it to the people who asked, but it was the truth. The relationship that had produced it had ended before she had known about the baby. Ended in the particular way that some relationships end, not with a single catastrophic break, but with a long, slow erosion during which she had tried to be reasonable and he had tried to be kind, and neither of them had succeeded at the thing they were actually trying to do, which was hold something together that had already come apart at its structural center. When she found out she was pregnant at 9 weeks, she had sat in the bathroom of her apartment for 40 minutes before she trusted herself to stand up. And then she had made a decision that had surprised even her, because she had always imagined that if she were ever in this situation, she would be paralyzed, and instead she was not. She had felt something move into place inside her, something that had nothing to do with reason or planning, and everything to do with a certainty so deep it did not need language. She was going to have this baby. She was going to figure out the rest. She had not told the father, not out of cruelty, but because he had moved 4 months after the breakup to Portugal with a woman he had met through work, and because Sylvie had looked at that situation honestly and understood that involving him would not have given her child a father so much as it would have given her child a complication. That calculation might be wrong. She knew that. She had written him a letter that she had not sent, which she kept in a folder on her laptop under a file name so neutral she sometimes forgot what it contained. What she wanted, more than almost anything, was to get through the next 8 weeks without anything else going wrong. The baby was healthy. She was healthy. She had a midwife she trusted. She had savings that would last until after the birth if she was careful. She had a brother who loved her even from a distance. She had decided that this was enough. What she had not factored in was Onyx. On the 3rd evening, the one that would change everything, she walked out onto Theo's small porch just after 6 in the evening because the light over the mountains was doing something extraordinary. The clouds that had been building all afternoon had gone from white to a deep amber gold that made the entire landscape look like it had been painted rather than photographed, and Sylvie, who had spent 4 years in design work before the pregnancy had reshuffled her priorities, felt the pull of it immediately. She took her phone to try to capture it and walked across the gravel yard toward the low wooden fence that separated Theo's property from the Harlan pasture because the view was better from there. She stopped. Onyx was at the fence, not near it. At it, he was standing with his head over the top rail in a way that she had not seen him do before. The other horses, 2 older Maras, whose names she had learned were Biscuit and Clover, were down at the far end of the pasture near the water trough, exactly where they usually were at this hour. Onyx was alone, and he was watching her with those dark, intelligent eyes, and something in his posture was different from the contained stillness she had observed before. He was not still. He was trembling very slightly in his front legs, in the way a dog will tremble when it is holding itself back from something. She stood there for a long moment. She told herself she should go back inside. She told herself what Garrett had said about not approaching him without asking first. She told herself she was 7 months pregnant and had no business doing anything impulsive. Then he made a sound, not a whinny, not the loud vocalization she associated with horses from a distance. It was something lower and more urgent, a sound from deep in his chest, and it moved through the cooling evening air toward her, like something directed specifically at her, and her body responded to it before her brain had processed what it meant. She had taken 2 steps forward before she realized she was moving. She stopped herself at the fence, close enough to see the detail of his face clearly, the way the amber light caught the edge of his eye, the way his nostrils were working steadily, drawing in information she could not perceive. He held his position. He did not move back. He did not show any of the agitation she had been warned about. He simply looked at her with an expression she would later struggle to describe, because the only word that came close was recognition. And she did not believe animals recognize strangers, and she did not understand why he would look at her that way. She reached out slowly and touched the side of his neck. His skin moved under her hand, the way a horse's skin does when it shifts against something. And then he went still again, and she stood there with her palm against his neck while the amber light faded toward red, and the temperature dropped 5 degrees in 20 minutes in the way it does in mountain country when a front is moving in faster than the forecasts account for. She should have gone back inside then. She did not, because the gate to the Harlan pasture was 20 feet to her left, and it was unlatched, and she had noticed that when she had walked over, and she had thought nothing of it. And then she had looked out past the fence at the pasture that stretched toward the tree line, and the light was still doing that thing, and she was still holding her phone, and the gate was right there, and she thought she would just step inside the fence for a better angle, just for a moment, and then she would go back in. She opened the gate and walked into the pasture. Onyx moved with her immediately, not threateningly, but the way a dog moves when it follows someone into a room. He positioned himself close to her left side, closer than she had expected, and she adjusted slightly to give herself more room. She raised her phone and took 3 photographs of the mountains and the dying light, and they were extraordinary, exactly what she had hoped for, and she was about to turn back when she felt the ground shift under her right foot. It was not dramatic. There was no warning. The ground was dry in most of the pasture, but this section near the fence line sat above a shallow drainage channel that ran underground, and the repeated passage of hooves over years had compressed and then gradually destabilized the soil in a way that was invisible from the surface. Her right foot went down 6 inches. Not far. But she was 32 weeks pregnant, and the center of her balance was not where it used to be, and she had been walking on uneven ground without thinking about her footing because she was looking at her phone. And when her foot went down those 6 inches, her body rotated forward and to the right before she could compensate, and she went down. She hit the ground on her right side, not her stomach. Her hip took the main impact, and her right arm came up in time to brace partially, and she lay there in the grass for a moment, processing what had happened. And her first thought was not about herself. Her first thought was about the baby, and she pressed her left hand to her abdomen and held absolutely still and waited, the way you wait in the aftermath of something sudden, for the information about whether what you feared had happened. The baby moved. A slow, firm roll of pressure from the inside, the kind of movement she had been learning to interpret for weeks. She exhaled. She tried to sit up. That was when she understood that something was wrong. The pain that came when she tried to push up from the ground was not in her arm or her hip where the impact had been. It was deeper and lower and interior in a way that pain in a joint or muscle is not. And it came from a place she had been told to monitor carefully because of a complication her midwife had flagged at 26 weeks. She had a condition called placenta previa, low-lying placenta, which had been reclassifying at her last 2 appointments, and which her midwife had told her was resolving in a positive direction, but which still carried, in any situation involving a fall or physical trauma, a set of risks that her midwife had described in careful, non-alarming language that Sylvie had understood entirely. The most significant risk was bleeding. Rapid, potentially concealed bleeding that she might not see clearly until it had already reached a threshold that required immediate medical intervention. She pressed her hand against her abdomen again. She tried to assess. The pain was not sharp in the way she imagined emergency pain would be. It was a pressure and the heat, and she told herself it was from the fall itself, from muscle and ligament reacting to impact, and she told herself to stay calm, and she attempted again to push herself upright. She could not do it. Her phone was in the grass, 3 feet away. She had let go of it when she fell. She shifted toward it, and the pain intensified, and she stopped and held still and breathed in through the nose and out slowly, the way she had been practicing in the prenatal classes. She had driven 40 minutes each way to attend, and she noticed, in the focused way that people notice things when their body is suddenly demanding their full attention, that it had gotten very dark very quickly, and that the wind had picked up, and that she could not hear the sound of the highway that was usually faintly audible even from the back of the property. She became, in that moment, very afraid. She had no neighbors in the immediate visual range. Garrett's house was at the far end of the property, close to 3/4 of a mile away, through 2 fields and a stand of oak trees. There was no line of sight. She did not have his phone number saved in her phone, which was 3 feet away, and which would require her to search for it in a way that would take time she was not sure she had. Her own phone was dark from the screen timing out. She called out as loudly as she could manage 3 times. Her voice came back to her from the tree line with a flatness that told her nothing was going to carry across that distance. She reached toward the phone. Onyx was still beside her. She had not fully registered this until now, in the strange narrowing of awareness that comes with pain and fear, but he had not moved. He was standing approximately 4 feet from where she had fallen, and he had not shied, had not startled, had not done any of the things she would have expected from a horse encountering a human falling suddenly in his proximity. He was simply there, and as she reached for the phone, he lowered his head. Not toward her. She watched him and did not understand at first what he was doing. He lowered his head all the way down until his nose was almost touching the ground, and then he raised it again, and the movement was deliberate in a way that was different from ordinary horse movement, repeated twice with a kind of insistence, and then he turned his head toward the far gate and turned it back to her. She dismissed this as coincidence. She was in pain, and she was frightened, and she needed her phone. She got her fingers around the phone and unlocked it and tried to find Garrett's number and discovered, as she had feared, that she did not have it. She had Theo's number. She called Theo first because Theo was her brother, and because that is the first thing a person does in the moments when fear overrides strategy. Theo did not answer. She left a voice message, and her voice broke in the middle of it, and she stopped and steadied herself and finished it, telling him where she was, telling him she had fallen, telling him she did not think she was badly hurt, but that she could not get up, and she was alone, and she was scared. Then she tried 911. The call connected and then dropped. She tried again. The call connected, and a dispatcher's voice came through, and then the signal deteriorated, and the call dropped again. She looked at the signal bar on her phone. 1 bar. She was in a valley, and the storm that was building in the atmosphere above her was already doing what mountain storms do to cellular signals when they are large enough and close enough. She tried texting. She sent a message to Theo with her location and the words fallen, cannot get up, need help, no cell signal, 7 miles from town. She had no way of knowing if it sent. The signal icon continued to fluctuate. She pressed her hand to her abdomen again. The pressure she had felt was still there. She could not be certain if it was worsening or if she was simply becoming more aware of it. She did not know enough from the outside to make that assessment. She needed someone who did. It was Onyx who moved first. She heard it before she saw it, a shift in his posture, a change in the sound of his breathing. And when she looked up from her phone, he was turned away from her and facing toward the direction of Garrett's house. His head was up and his ears were forward, and his entire body had the tension of a horse that is about to move. He looked back at her once. It was not anthropomorphism to notice the look. It was simply a horse turning its head. But the timing of it, the economy of it, the way he held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds before turning back toward the distant fence, was something she could not dismiss. He left at a full run. She understood several things in rapid succession. She understood that she was alone. She understood that a horse running across a field in the dark was not the same as help arriving. She understood that she could not follow him, and that she could not stand, and that she was in a field in deteriorating weather, with a possible medical emergency developing inside her body, and the only witness to her situation was gone. What she did not know, because she could not see it from where she lay, was what Onyx did next. Garrett Harlan was coming back from his barn when he heard it. He was carrying a coil of rope and a flashlight, and he had been out checking the water lines because the temperature had been dropping faster than he liked, and he was thinking about the pipes near the south wall. The sound he heard was not a distress whinny in the way that most people imagine horse sounds work. It was a sound he had not heard from that horse in the 2 years he had kept him, a particular rhythmic vocalization that he could not have described accurately to anyone who had not been around horses as long as he had, but which activated in him something below the level of rational thought. He had been around horses for 40 years. His body understood some things his brain had not yet processed. He turned on his flashlight and moved toward the sound. Onyx was at the fence between the back pasture and the lower paddock, which was the closest point to Garrett's position that the horse could have reached from the main field. He was not frantic in the way a spooked horse is frantic. He was making that sound steadily, rhythmically, and when Garrett's flashlight caught his eyes, they reflected back with a steadiness that was not the rolling, white-showing eyes of a frightened animal. He was looking directly at Garrett. He moved back from the fence. He moved forward again. He did it twice more. Garrett said later that it took him about 8 seconds to understand. He was not a man given to sentimentality about animals, but he had been around enough of them long enough to have learned that there are moments when an animal communicates something with such insistence and such clarity of body that dismissing it would not be skepticism. It would be stupidity. He said, "What is it?" He said it the way you say it to a dog when the dog is telling you something. Onyx turned toward the main field. Garrett moved. He found her 12 minutes later. He had called her name twice before his flashlight found her, lying on her side in the grass with her phone in her hand and her other hand pressed against her abdomen. She was conscious. She was calm in the deliberate way that people are calm when they are working very hard to stay calm, because they know that panic will cost them something they cannot afford to lose. Garrett crouched beside her and asked her what hurt and where. He asked about the pregnancy. He asked about the fall. He assessed her with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades around livestock and understood enough basic physical trauma to ask the right questions without asking the unnecessary ones. She told him about the placenta previa. She watched his expression process this information and remained steady, which was one of the most comforting things she had ever seen a human face do. He made 2 calls. The first was to 911. He had full signal from his position because he was standing on slightly elevated ground at the edge of the field, and he knew the position, had tested it before when checking signal coverage for exactly this kind of situation. He gave coordinates and described the medical situation and the access road clearly and without wasted words. The second call was to the nearest hospital, 64 miles away, to confirm that they had obstetric surgery capability available. They did. He told her help was coming. He told her to stay still. He told her she had done the right thing by not trying to get up. He sat down in the grass beside her because the ground was cold, and she was shivering, and the ambient temperature had dropped another 4 degrees in the time it had taken him to find her. And he told her to lean into him for warmth if she needed to. And she did not lean in the way someone leans on a stranger, but she shifted a few degrees toward the warmth he was offering, and he adjusted to compensate. And they sat there together in the dark while the wind moved through the grass around them. Onyx had followed them back to this point and stood a short distance away, facing away from them toward the tree line, not moving, ears forward, as though keeping watch. Garrett noticed this. He did not comment on it, but he noticed it. The ambulance took 31 minutes to reach the property from the moment the call connected, which was faster than the standard response time for that area, because the crew had been returning from a call to counties over and were already closer to the access road than they would normally be. The paramedics were professional and calm and moved quickly. They stabilized Sylvie on a board, which she hated not because of the discomfort, but because lying flat increased the intensity of the interior pressure she had been monitoring. And the look on the paramedic's face when she described the pressure was the look of a person revising their assessment upward. They were moving within 4 minutes of arriving. The ride was 64 miles, and parts of it were on roads that demanded care rather than speed. And Sylvie lay in the back of the ambulance with sensors attached to her, and a paramedic named Will beside her who had dark circles under his eyes and the practiced calm of someone who had been on shift for 11 hours and was not going to let her see his concern. She appreciated this. She watched the ceiling of the ambulance and breathed and talked to the baby in the quiet interior voice she had developed over the past weeks. Not words so much as a tone, a steady reassurance that she was not entirely sure it was going in the right direction, but which she needed to be producing regardless. The baby moved twice during the ride. Both times she exhaled. They reached the hospital at 10:47 in the evening. What the imaging showed was something that the attending obstetrician, a woman named Dr. Carver, who had the precision and economy of movement that comes from 20 years of emergency obstetric work, described to Sylvie the following morning in the terms she had been trained to give, which were honest without being brutal. There had been a partial abruption, not a full separation of the placenta from the uterine wall, which would have been a different and more catastrophic conversation, but a partial one, enough to have caused the internal bleeding that Sylvie had felt as pressure and heat, but not as pain, because the body is strange in the ways it reports damage to itself. And sometimes the things that are most serious are the ones that feel the least dramatic until they do not. If she had stayed in the field for another hour, the bleeding would have progressed. If it had progressed to the threshold that triggers the cascade she had been warned about in those careful prenatal conversations, the outcome for the baby would have been a different one. The doctor used the word could have and not would have, but Sylvie understood the mathematics of what was being communicated. The margin was measured in minutes. She spent 4 days in the hospital. She received a transfusion. She was monitored continuously. The baby's heart rate was steady throughout, which the nursing staff told her was remarkable in context, and which she believed because it was consistent with everything she had understood about this particular child since the moment she had decided to have her. Her daughter was born 6 weeks later, at 38 weeks, by scheduled cesarean section in the same hospital, healthy and loud and weighing 7 pounds 4 ounces, with a full head of dark hair that made the delivering nurse laugh in delight when she saw it. But there is a piece of this story that happened before any of that, in the time between when Sylvie fell and when Garrett found her, that she did not know about until weeks after her daughter was born, when she went back to the property to see Garrett and to thank him properly, and to let him meet the baby, who was by then 6 weeks old and deeply aware of the world around her in the way that some newborns are, turning towards sound, tracking light, already in possession of some quiet opinion about everything she encountered. Garrett told her what Onyx had done. Not all of it, because some of it was beyond his ability to explain without it sounding wrong, but the parts he was certain of. He told her how the horse had come to the fence at the closest point to his position. He told her about the sound, the particular vocalization that he had never heard from that horse before and had not heard since. He told her about the 2-year period during which he had watched Onyx carefully and had learned the full vocabulary of his behavior, and about how what happened that night had sat outside every pattern he had established. He said there were things he did not understand, and he was comfortable with that. Then he told her the other part, the part that she had not known about, the part that, when she learned it, made her sit in his kitchen with her daughter in her arms and say nothing for a long time. When Garrett had followed Onyx back across the field with his flashlight, moving fast, calling her name, he had not come directly to the place where she had fallen. He had been moving toward the eastern section of the field, first because that was the direction the horse had started in, and he had been a few degrees off from the correct position. Onyx had corrected him. The horse had cut in front of Garrett's path, not erratically but precisely, and turned back toward the correct direction, and Garrett had followed, and that correction had taken him to Sylvie approximately 2 minutes faster than he would have arrived otherwise. 2 minutes. Garrett said he had not known what to do with that information. He had worked with horses for 40 years, and he had seen smart horses do remarkable things, and he believed deeply in the intelligence of animals in ways that most people did not, because he had earned that belief through proximity and time. But he said this had been different. He said that what Onyx had done that night had not felt like animal instinct. He said it had felt like something that understood the entire situation better than he did. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I do not talk about things I cannot explain, but I think he smelled it. I think he knew what was happening inside her before any of us did. I think he has been paying attention to her since she got here. And I think that when she went down, he made a decision." Sylvie asked him what kind of decision. Garrett looked out the window toward the pasture, where Onyx was visible in the morning light, standing at the far fence, his black coat catching the sun, the way it always caught the sun, which was to absorb it rather than reflect it, so that he seemed to contain the light rather than give it back. He said, the kind of decision to not leave her alone. There is a science to what horses can detect that has been a subject of increasing research in the years since that night, not connected to Sylvie's case specifically, but expanding what the world knows about animal perception in ways that would have provided a framework for understanding what Onyx did, if anyone had cared to look. Horses have a sense of smell approximately 3 times more sensitive than a dog's in certain frequency ranges, and dramatically more sensitive than any human. They can detect minute chemical changes in the air around a person's body. They can detect shifts in breathing, in cortisol production, in the particular signature that blood leaves in the air when its chemistry changes. They can detect the electromagnetic variations that accompany certain physiological states. None of this is mysticism. All of it is documented. What it means in practical terms is that a horse with sufficient sensitivity, intelligence, and trust relationship can perceive things about a human body that no human technology in a field can currently replicate. Whether Onyx detected the abruption beginning, whether he detected the temperature drop in Sylvie's skin, the shift in her breathing, the chemistry of fear and pain moving through her pores, whether he acted on any of this consciously in the way a human acts consciously, or whether he acted in the way animals act, through pure encoded response to perceived reality, is something no one can say with certainty. What can be said is that he noticed something when no one else did, that he went to the fence at the exact moment she walked toward the property, that he knew what was happening, 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 that he knew that he was beside her when she fell, that he did not leave when she needed him to leave, and that he ran when she needed him to run, and led and corrected, and did not stop until the person who needed to find her had found her. The doctor who reviewed the case told Sylvie that had she remained in the field for another 40 to 60 minutes, the course of the abruption would have progressed beyond the threshold at which the conservative intervention they had used would have been sufficient. She told her this in the measured language of medical certainty, and Sylvie had listened and asked one question. She asked whether the timing had been close. The doctor had paused before answering. Then she said that in her 20 years of obstetric medicine, she had learned not to assign the word close to situations she could not quantify precisely. But she said that the window in which the outcome remained what it was, rather than something else entirely, was not a large one. Sylvie did not cry in the doctor's office. She had become, in the months since her daughter's birth, someone slightly harder to knock off center than she had been before all of this, in the way that people who survive a thing they were not sure they would survive sometimes become. She had cried in private, and she had cried in her daughter's presence, and she had let herself feel all of it without managing it more than was necessary. But in the doctor's office, she simply nodded and thanked her and said she understood. She understood more than she said. Her daughter's name is Nora. Sylvie chose it before she knew what she would name her, in the strange way that names sometimes arrive fully formed before they are understood. She had written it in a notebook in the hospital in the morning after her surgery and looked at it for a long time and felt that it was right without being able to explain why. It was only later, in the particular way that things reveal themselves in the aftermath of something transformative, that she made the connection she had not been looking for. Her grandmother, who had died when Sylvie was 11, had kept horses. One horse, specifically, a dark Marais she had loved completely, whom she had ridden through the mountains of Vermont every summer of Sylvie's early childhood, who had been present at every important event in her grandmother's life, and whom her grandmother had spoken about with the kind of reverence that most people reserve for people rather than animals. That horse had been named Nora. Sylvie had not thought of this in years. She is not certain whether the name arrived from memory or from something else, and she has stopped trying to resolve that question because resolving it is less important than holding it. She holds it the same way she holds everything about that night, not lightly, not heavily, but with both hands, and with the understanding that she is carrying something that is larger than her ability to fully comprehend it. On a Saturday in early spring, approximately 4 months after Nora's birth, Sylvie drove back to the property with her daughter in the car seat and Theo beside her in the passenger seat, finally back from his construction job in a state of barely contained guilt about everything that had happened while he was away. A guilt she had spent considerable effort in the preceding weeks trying to release him from, because she needed him present and not collapsed, and because it was not, in any measurable sense, his fault. Garrett was waiting for them at the gate. He had made coffee, and there were 2 of his neighbors there as well. An older woman named Eugenia, who had lived on adjacent land for 30 years, and who had known about the event, because information moves the way. Information moves in a county where everyone's lives are adjacent to each other. And a younger man named Cale, who helped Garrett part-time, and who was 23 and not good at disguising his emotions, and who looked at the baby with an expression of pure, uncomplicated wonder that Sylvie found more moving than most things adults express. They sat on Garrett's porch and drank coffee, and Sylvie held Nora and let people look at her and ask about her, and she answered the questions she was always asked and deflected the ones she was always tired of being asked. And eventually, as these visits tend to do, it came to the moment she had known would come. Garrett asked her if she wanted to see him. She had thought about this. She had thought about it more than she had thought about most things. She had wondered what it would feel like, and whether she would experience it the way she imagined she would, and whether she was attaching too much significance to it. and whether the significance was perhaps exactly the right amount, and her caution was only the remnant of a habit of minimizing things that she was still in the process of unlearning. She said yes. They walked out to the far pasture, Garrett and Sylvie and Nora, and Theo stayed behind on the porch because this was not his moment and he understood it. Eugenia stayed behind as well. Cale followed at a respectful distance, which said something about him. Onyx was at the center of the field, which was greening in the early spring in the particular luminous way that the mountains green in April, a color so alive it almost is sound. He saw them coming, and he did not move away. He watched them approach with those dark, deep-set eyes that had always seemed to her to be processing more than they were revealing. His mane moved in the light breeze. His coat caught the spring light and gave it back in the way it always did, which was to hold it rather than reflect it. She stopped a few feet from him. She was holding Nora in the way she always held her, tucked against her left side with Nora's head on her shoulder and Nora's dark hair visible above the blanket. And she felt the weight of her daughter in her arms and the spring air on her face and the ground solid beneath her feet and Onyx in front of her, and all of it was present simultaneously, and she did not try to manage any of it. He lowered his head slowly. Not all the way to the ground this time. He lowered it in the particular way he had moved it that night, that deliberate, communicative arc, and held it for a moment. And she watched him and did not speak, because there was nothing she could have said that would have been the right thing. Nora made a sound. A small, formless, exploratory sound, the kind of sound 4-month-olds make when they are registering something new. Her head turned toward Onyx with the unfiltered attention of an infant encountering something that has captured her entire sensory awareness. Onyx was still. The wind moved through the grass. Garrett stood back and said nothing. The mountains were pale blue in the distance, in the way they are in early spring before the full green comes in. Sylvie put her free hand on the side of Onyx's neck, the same place she had touched him that evening in the amber light, the last calm moment before everything that followed. His skin moved the same way. The warmth of him was the same. She did not cry in the way she thought she would. What she felt instead was something calmer and older and more complete than crying, a feeling of debt that was too large to ever settle, but that she was not trying to settle, only to carry with gratitude for as long as she was given. She stood there for a long time. Nora reached out in the blind, trusting, reaching toward the world way of small children, and her tiny hand opened and closed against the air between them, and Onyx, without moving, breathed, and the breath moved over Nora's hand like something given. Garrett told Sylvie later, as they were leaving, that Onyx had changed after that night, not dramatically, not in any way that would be obvious to someone who had not been watching him for 2 years. But he said that in the weeks after the night she had fallen, the horse had moved differently through the pasture. He said he had started coming to the fence in the mornings when Garrett brought the water. He said he had accepted physical contact from Garrett without the careful boundary enforcement that had defined 2 years of their relationship. He said it was as though something had shifted, as though the horse had done what he had been working toward, had completed something, and could now stand in a different relationship to the world. Sylvie asked Garrett if he believed that horses understood what they had done. He looked at her for a long time. He was a man who did not answer questions he had not fully considered, which was one of the things she had come to admire about him in the months since that night. He said he believed that animals understood what mattered. He said he believed they felt things in proportion to what things deserved, without the distortion that human cognition adds to experience. He said he believed that what Onyx had done was not an accident, and not an instinct in the simple sense that people use that word when they mean an animal did not think about it. He believed the horse had been paying attention since the first day, in the way that some creatures pay attention that most of us have forgotten how to pay, and that when the moment came, he had acted in full accordance with what he understood. That was all he said. That was enough. There is a photograph that Sylvie took on the morning of their visit, not on the phone she had been holding when she fell, which she had replaced, but on a small camera she had started carrying again after Nora was born, because she had remembered, in the sleep-deprived, clarified way of new motherhood, that she had loved photography before she had reduced herself to what was practical. In the photograph, Nora is on her shoulder, and Onyx is in front of them, and the mountains are behind both of them, pale and vast and old, in the way that mountains are old, in a way that makes human events look brief against their permanence, and also, somehow, more rather than less significant for that contrast. The photograph is the lock screen on Sylvie's phone. She has been asked about it many times by people who see it and want to know the story. She answers them. She tells them all of it, the way she has told it here. She does not embellish, and she does not minimize. She does not claim more than she knows, and she does not dismiss what she experienced because it falls outside what is expected. She is asked, always, whether she thinks it was a miracle. She pauses every time, in the way she has learned to pause before that particular question, which deserves the pause. Then she says that she does not know what miracles look like from the inside, that she suspects they might look exactly like this, like a black horse in an amber field, turning his head toward a woman he had no reason to protect in the last quiet moment before everything went wrong, like a sound moving through the dark toward a man with a flashlight, like 2 minutes, like a decision that no one has yet found the right word for, like a little girl with dark hair reaching toward the world with open hands,